Before the world knew, a confession was spoken in whispers. A confession that black people in America are the original Jews from the Bible. For centuries, history has been painted in the colors of power, and the voices of the true Israelites, African Hebrews, the lost tribes scattered across oceans, were silenced beneath chains and exile. But the echoes remain, carved into prophecy, hidden in the transatlantic slave trade, woven into the identity of African-American Israelites, Beta Israel of Ethiopia, the Igbo of Nigeria, the Lemba of South Africa, and the timeless covenant of Deuteronomy 28. Why has the world been told another story? Why do the descendants of those carried on ships, fulfilling prophecy, still fight to be seen as the true children of Israel? What truth has been buried under centuries of exile, conversion, and denial? And what happens when the rejected stone becomes the cornerstone of God's covenant? In this journey, you will discover the forgotten kingdoms of Africa, where Jewish life flourished long before Europe claimed the name. You will see how Timbuktu became the Jerusalem of Africa, how DNA reveals priestly bloodlines in tribes dismissed by the world, and how the Exodus story is reborn in the suffering and survival of African Americans. You will feel the weight of prophecy fulfilled in silence, and the power of memory carried in song, ritual, and resistance. This is not just history, it is healing. It is identity. It is the awakening of a people who were despised, enslaved, and dismissed, yet may be the very cornerstone of God's eternal promise. Comment. What you believe about who the real Israelites are, like if this truth stirs your spirit, and subscribe to stand with those who carry the covenant in their blood, their struggle, and their song. For the truth is heavy, but together we can carry it. Silenced histories and forgotten narratives. For centuries, the world has been told a version of history polished by the victors and repeated until it felt like truth. Yet in the shadows, another story beats like a buried drum, waiting to be heard. The voices of the original Jews, the African Hebrews, the lost tribes, scattered through exile and captivity, were deliberately silenced. The question that burns is simple. Why? Why were African Jews erased from the narrative? Why were the children of Israel rebranded under a different face, a different color, a different lineage? The answer lies in power. When the Khazar kingdom in Eastern Europe converted to Judaism, they entered the story not by blood, but by choice. And over generations, their descendants became what much of the modern world recognizes as Jews. Yet this truth has been hidden, because to admit it would unravel centuries of control, unravel the dominance of European imagination over faith and scripture. Silence became a weapon. Entire civilizations learned to forget, to look at black greatness and dismiss it as myth, to look at Jewish kingdoms in Africa and call them legend. Imagine how different the world would be if school books spoke of African Israelites with the same reverence they reserve for Rome or Greece. Imagine if the transatlantic slave trade was taught not only as human tragedy, but also as prophetic fulfillment, written in Deuteronomy 28:68. History has never been neutral. Silence has always been a design. And when you look deeper, you see the fingerprints of deliberate forgetting. This is not just about race. This is about identity, about covenant, about who carries the blood of Israel and who carries the memory. The lesson is piercing. When truth is silenced, it does not die. It waits. It waits in DNA markers found among the Lemba tribe. It waits in the oral stories of the Igbo. It waits in the resilience of African Americans who sing Exodus in gospel hymns. The silenced past is rising, and with it comes the question, who gets to define Israel? Comment. Your thoughts. Should identity be defined by blood, by covenant, or by memory? This is not just history, it is destiny. God's pattern in empires and exiles. From the beginning, the Bible teaches that kingdoms rise and fall like waves against the shore, but the covenant of God remains unbroken. Egypt enslaved Israel, yet Egypt fell. Babylon burned Jerusalem, yet Babylon became dust. Rome crucified and scattered, yet Rome collapsed under its own weight. Persia, Greece, even mighty Islamic caliphates, all rose, all fell, yet the covenant endured in the people God chose. Look at history with clear eyes. In 710 AD, Tariq ibn Ziyad burned his ships on the shores of Spain, declaring that retreat was not an option. The Moors, African Muslims, ruled Iberia for nearly 800 years, bringing science, mathematics and medicine when Europe was trapped in its dark ages. At the same time, Timbuktu flourished as a city of scholars, home to libraries richer than the entire European continent. The world was never as one-sided as the textbooks claimed. God allowed empires to shine for a season, then wither, to prove one lesson: no throne lasts forever except his covenant. The fall of each empire reveals the same truth. Human pride builds towers of power, but divine design humbles them all. The Israelites, exiled again and again, were never erased because exile was not destruction, it was refinement. African Hebrews carried the covenant through desert sands, across oceans, even chained in the hulls of slave ships. Survival itself became testimony. When you see empires collapse, understand this. History is not random, it is patterned. God writes in cycles, and exile is always followed by return. The lesson is unshakable. Nations may dominate, cultures may conquer, but those bound by covenant endure beyond the ashes of empire. This is why African American Israelites today, though despised, mocked and dismissed, may in truth be the clearest witness of prophecy. Their survival through the harshest exile, slavery, segregation, systemic rejection, mirrors the survival of Israel itself. When you see this pattern, you begin to ask, is America just another empire in God's story, destined to fall like the rest? If the covenant rests with those who suffered most, what does that say about who the true children of Israel really are? Timbuktu, Jerusalem of Africa. Picture a city rising out of the desert, its walls humming with the voices of scholars, its streets filled with manuscripts that preserved knowledge the rest of the world forgot. Timbuktu, a name Europe reduced to a metaphor for distance, was in truth a crown jewel of civilization. Called the Jerusalem of Africa, it was home to libraries so vast that their manuscripts outweighed the entire collection of Europe's medieval archives. In those libraries lay scriptures, scientific treatises, records of Jewish presence, and testimonies of faith. Ibn Battuta, the great traveller, spoke in awe of its justice and its literacy, where even children could read, and where law was tied to God, not the whim of kings. This was Africa not as darkness, but as light, a continent carrying wisdom when the so-called civilized world stumbled in ignorance. Yet centuries of colonial imagination dismissed Timbuktu as myth, branding Africa as primitive to justify conquest. That dismissal was not accident. It was strategy. For if the world admitted that Africa housed centers of faith, knowledge, and Jewish presence, then the narrative of white superiority would collapse. Imagine the children of Israel thriving in Timbuktu, their songs echoing through synagogues and mosques alike, their covenant alive in a land Europe called savage. This is the wound history inflicted. By erasing Timbuktu, it erased memory. The lesson here is healing. True greatness is not measured by conquest, but by knowledge rooted in God. A civilization that placed scripture and study above war built a legacy of resilience. And if Timbuktu could be forgotten, how many other African Jewish kingdoms were erased? How many stories of Israelites in Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were silenced so that only one version of Israel remained? But truth is not so easily buried. Today, scholars uncover manuscripts, DNA confirms priestly lines, and oral histories speak with renewed authority. Timbuktu rises again, not in stone, but in memory, reminding us that Israel's covenant was never confined to Europe. Comment. If you believe the world deliberately erased Timbuktu to keep this truth hidden, and share this story so others may remember. For when memory is restored, identity is healed, and the children of Israel, once dismissed, stand revealed. The African Jewish Kingdoms. Across the sands of history, forgotten voices call out from kingdoms that once bore the covenant of Israel. Ghana, long before it was reduced to a footnote, carried the rhythm of Jewish life until around the year 1000 AD. Mali and Songhai followed, empires where merchants prayed in Hebrew, where scriptures crossed deserts on camel caravans, where Jewish presence was as natural as the rising sun. Travelers like Eldad the Danite wrote of Jews thriving in Africa, speaking of tribes and communities that clung to the law of Moses when the rest of the world doubted their existence. Consider the Ethiopian Beta Israel, who for centuries guarded their faith through exile and persecution, believing themselves descendants of the tribe of Dan. Think of the Lemba in southern Africa, who kept rituals so distinctly Hebraic that when modern science tested their blood, the Cohen priestly gene appeared, confirming what oral tradition had always proclaimed. Reflect on the Igbo of Nigeria, millions who declare themselves children of Israel, whose songs, proverbs, and customs echo ancient Hebrew ways. The evidence is carved not only in DNA, but in memory, in ritual, in unbroken tradition. Yet these testimonies were dismissed because they challenged the monopoly of a European image of Israel. Imagine if the world had embraced Africa's Jewish kingdoms with the same reverence reserved for Jerusalem or Babylon. What healing would it bring if every child knew that the covenant was not confined to pale skin, but lived in the rich soil of Africa? The lesson here is luminous. Identity cannot be erased when it is sealed by covenant. Comment. What you believe. Should history accept these African Jews as equal heirs of Israel? Or should bloodlines only be recognized when they match European imagination? The transatlantic slave trade, a new exodus. Deuteronomy 28:68 speaks with haunting clarity. The Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. Egypt meant bondage, and centuries later, ships carried millions of Africans into bondage once more across the Atlantic. The prophecy was not abstract. It was lived in chains, in the belly of vessels where men, women, and children were stacked like cargo, where cries rose to heaven like incense of sorrow. America became the new Egypt, a land of forced labor, humiliation, and exile. Yet in the darkest pit, prophecy shone as a thread of destiny. Black Hebrew Israelites in America looked to Scripture and saw their story written in ancient ink. They declared that the suffering of African Americans was not meaningless cruelty, but fulfillment of covenant, that the transatlantic slave trade was not just history, it was prophecy reborn. What looks like a curse can be reframed as destiny. What looks like exile can be the path to redemption. The gospel songs of slaves, whispering, "Go down, Moses," or "Swing low, sweet chariot," were not only music, but coded testimony, affirmations that God had not abandoned his people. Just as Moses led Israel out of Egypt, so too would deliverance come for the descendants of those carried on ships. Think of the parallels. Whips on backs echoing Pharaoh's overseers, cotton fields replacing brickyards, yet the covenant thread refusing to break. The lesson is healing, but also piercing. Suffering does not erase identity, it confirms it. Comment. If you see the slave ships as the very fulfillment of Deuteronomy's warning, a sign that African Americans are the living witness of Israel's covenant. Modern struggles for recognition. Even in our own age, the struggle for recognition continues. Ethiopia's Beta Israel were airlifted into Israel during Operation Moses and Operation Solomon. Miracles of return after centuries of isolation. Yet upon arrival, many faced discrimination, rejection, and doubt from those who claimed authority over Jewish identity. Their blood carried Israel, their customs bore witness, yet their skin became their stumbling block in the eyes of gatekeepers. In the United States, black Hebrews are often dismissed as extremists, caricatured by media, while Ashkenazi traditions dominate synagogues, scholarship, and recognition. Meanwhile, the Igbo of Nigeria, millions strong, remain unrecognized, trapped between Christianity and a Jewish establishment that hesitates to embrace them. Recognition, it seems, is not only about faith, but about power. To deny African Israelites their place is to preserve a racial hierarchy hidden under the language of tradition. But the question remains, who decides who is a Jew? Is it the rabbis of Europe, the DNA tests of scientists, or the covenant lived through suffering and survival? The lesson here is clear. Denial does not erase truth. It only delays justice. And justice delayed becomes a wound that festers across generations. Imagine the healing the world would see if black Israelites were fully embraced, if the children of the slave trade were acknowledged as the covenant people, if the words of the prophets were read with African faces in mind. Comment. Your thoughts. Should recognition be dictated by tradition, by science, or by the undeniable survival of those who have carried Israel's burden through centuries of exile? The struggle continues, but with every voice raised, with every truth spoken, the silence weakens, and the cornerstone once rejected begins to rise again. Who is a Jew? Blood, covenant, or memory? The question cuts like fire through history. Who is a Jew? Is it determined by bloodline, by covenant, or by the memory etched into a people's soul? If Rabbinic Europe alone defines Jewish identity, then Africa's Israelites are cast aside, their faith ignored, their covenant erased. If genetics alone decides, then the countless generations of converts who chose the God of Israel are silenced, as though faith means nothing without DNA. But if covenant and survival carry the weight, then the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, the African Hebrews, the Beta Israel, the Igbo, the Lemba, all who endured exile and chains may stand as the truest witnesses of Israel's story. History shows us that bloodlines bend, records burn, names are changed, but covenant endures through suffering. The African-American Israelites, who sang of Moses while breaking under whips, who clung to hope in Deuteronomy's curses, embody the covenant in ways no scroll could erase. The mistake the world often makes is reducing Jewishness to race or ritual, forgetting that Abraham himself was called not by blood, but by obedience, not by lineage, but by faith. Consider the resilience of Ethiopian Jews who guarded the Sabbath under persecution, or the Igbo who kept fragments of Hebrew rituals even while surrounded by Christianity. Memory, suffering, covenant. These are the true markers of Israel. The lesson is piercing. The truest children of Israel may not be those who hold power in synagogues today, but those who carried exile in their bodies and survival in their souls. Comment. What you believe. Should Jewish identity rest in blood or in the covenant that survives through exile? The debate is not just theological, it is personal, it is healing, it is liberation for those long denied. Cultural echoes and prophetic voices. Even when history tried to silence the truth, culture carried it like a flame hidden under cloth. Listen to the gospel songs of enslaved Africans in America. Go down, Moses. Steal away to Jesus. These were not just hymns, they were coded declarations of identity. A secret cry that they were the children of Israel, waiting for deliverance. In reggae, Bob Marley turned scripture into anthem, singing Exodus with the voice of a prophet, telling the world that Africa's children still remembered Zion. In the voices of activists like Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr., the language of Exodus became the blueprint for liberation, echoing Moses demanding freedom from Pharaoh. These echoes are not coincidence. They are prophecy made song. They are memory refusing to die. Even in modern times, DNA tests spark renewed curiosity as African Americans discover links to ancient tribes, fueling a reclamation of dignity. Rituals, songs, and even names whisper the covenant across generations. The lesson is healing. Memory can be buried, but it will rise again through art, through music, through the resilience of people who refuse to forget. Every gospel song, every reggae lyric, every march for freedom is a testimony that the covenant did not die in exile. It lives, pulsing through culture, resisting erasure. This is why the struggle for identity is not only about recognition in religious institutions, but about reclaiming dignity stolen by centuries of silence. Comment. If you believe music and culture are proof of prophecy, if the voices of the oppressed are in fact the voices of Israel echoing through time, the healing truth is this: no matter how deep the exile, memory survives, and through memory, identity is restored. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and in that sacred reversal, we find the heartbeat of this entire journey. The world spent centuries pointing to Europe, to pale faces and royal courts, to rabbis in distant lands, declaring, "Here is Israel." But the echoes of prophecy, the songs of Exodus, the very chains of the transatlantic slave trade scream another truth, that the descendants of Africa, the ones carried into exile on ships, the ones who built America with blood and tears, the ones mocked and dismissed as outsiders, may be the original Jews the Bible spoke of. This is not a shallow claim. It is written in Deuteronomy 28, carved in DNA, whispered in oral traditions, carried in gospel hymns, and shouted in the rhythms of reggae and resistance. And when you listen closely, you hear the voice of God reminding the world that his covenant was never bound by Europe's imagination, but by the survival of a people who refused to be erased. Imagine the weight of that truth. African Hebrews, Beta Israel in Ethiopia, the Igbo in Nigeria, the Lemba in South Africa, African-American Israelites in America. They all carry fragments of a shattered mirror, reflecting back the face of Israel that history tried to bury. And yet, like a seed pressed deep into soil, the memory rose again. Through slavery, through exile, through rejection, through silence, the covenant did not die. It lived in the cry of mothers separated from their children, in the prayers whispered in cotton fields, in the psalms turned into spirituals sung under the stars. Even when the world told them they were nothing, prophecy told them they were chosen. Even when empire after empire tried to erase them, God's pattern declared, "What is rejected on earth is remembered in heaven." This is more than history. This is identity. This is healing. When black people in America rise and say, "We are the children of Israel," they are not inventing. They are remembering. They are piecing together what centuries of silence tried to scatter. And when the world resists this truth, it proves how heavy it really is. Because if the rejected stone is the cornerstone, then the power shifts forever. The last become first, the despised become exalted, the enslaved become the testimony of prophecy fulfilled. That is why this conversation is dangerous to some, but liberating to others. Because to admit that the true Israelites include the very people who were chained, whipped, and mocked is to admit that God writes history not in palaces, but in prisons, not in temples of marble, but in songs of survival. Look at the signs. Khazar conversions in Europe point to a borrowed lineage, while African tribes hold rituals and bloodlines older than many European claims. Timbuktu's libraries, once dismissed as myth, contained scriptures and histories richer than medieval Europe. Ethiopian Jews carried the Torah through centuries without ever hearing of Europe's rabbis. African-American Israelites turned Deuteronomy into lived prophecy on slave ships. The evidence is not scattered. It is overwhelming. The lesson is clear. Israel's story is not whitewashed. It is earth-stained, sweat-soaked, sung through chains, and remembered in Africa's heartbeat. And now comes the question that pierces the soul. If the true Israelites are those who suffered most, those who carried exile on their backs, what does that mean for the world today? Does recognition belong only to those with authority and wealth, or to those whose very survival testifies of covenant? Comment. Your thoughts. Should Israel be defined by blood, by covenant, or by the endurance of suffering? This is not a simple debate. It is a turning point for how we see history, race, and faith itself. What you have heard is not meant to divide, but to awaken. Because awakening is healing. To know that your suffering was not meaningless, to know that your exile was foreseen, to know that your survival is prophecy fulfilled, that is freedom. African-American Israelites, Beta Israel, Igbo, Lemba, all carry the light of a covenant that empires tried to extinguish. And you, the listener, are part of this awakening. If this truth stirs your heart, if it gives you a glimpse of light in the middle of dark days, if it helps you see dignity in the face of pain, then let it move you to act. Like this message, Subscribe so you can walk with us through more hidden truths, and share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice is part of the restoration. If this video brought value to your soul, if it gave you healing or strength, I invite you to pour a little energy back so we can continue creating more of these revelations, more of these reminders of God's truth. Every act of support, no matter how small, is priceless. It fuels the mission to bring light where silence once ruled. From my heart, I thank you. The truth is heavy, yes, but it is also liberating. And together we can carry it. Together we can lift the rejected stone and see it shine as the cornerstone of God's eternal covenant. The story is not over. It is only beginning, and you are part of it.